out of my dorm. Get out. Hey, I'm warning you, do not take another step toward me.
See how they teach the children to treat their guests.
Wakanda Forever. Guys, what are your thoughts on this movie? Did you like it? Was it good? Was it solid? What's up? If you're new here, my name is Kenim. I want to talk about Wakanda Forever and my thoughts on it and why I feel this movie was a disservice to Blackness. Whew, that's a big statement. Wakanda Forever was a disservice to Blackness. I'll even go as far as saying this movie was a revenge movie of the marginalized American groups, right? Marginalized groups in America. It was a disservice to Blackness, and specifically, I'll conclude in a bit. But let me break this down for you. Why I feel this movie was a disservice to Blackness. Honestly, for me, it was unsatisfying for me as an African woman to see them force a story about another marginalized group into this movie. This is where I accept that this film is an American story from an American perspective and not an African one. And I will conclude by saying that this is why it's extremely important for Africans or blacks and Africans, right, to tell our own stories. Because this movie was a black story helmed through the lens of white supremacy. Let's begin. The big statements here, big statements. This movie was helmed through the lens of white supremacy. So why would I say that? First of all, I will first explain that when it comes down to it, yes, the cast of Wakanda Forever were black. Yes, the director is black. Yes, but this is still a Disney movie. This is still, Marvel. And these are still white executives that they are answering to when they're making these stories. They still have to comply with whiteness. And then that makes you think about the perspective of the creators, because at the end of the day, look, you as a Ryan Coogler sit there, he could write whatever he wants to write. He still has to get it approved by white executives. And a system, right, that is only empowered us to make Black Panther in the first place because they financially benefited from it. But their true agenda is not really to liberate black people. Their true agenda is to tell stories and monetize those stories, right, without losing their control of the world. Because at the end of the day, white supremacy runs the world currently that we live in. And this system in Hollywood that has encouraged white supremacist ideals, the world that we're in has always encouraged white supremacist ideals. And as social media opened up the doors and made us chip away at that, complain about things, spot things out, they have had to open up the doors for us a little bit. But ultimately, this is about control, and they're never going to give up their control. Because as long as white society can dictate what is acceptable in the world, and they can allow us to exist within the spaces that they create, well, they continue to have that control. But the moment that we empower black people in a way that could really give us the control that they have, even though that's not really what we're looking for necessarily, can't speak for everyone. But if we give them that, if they give us that power, so ultimately my point is Marvel, Disney, their agenda, I repeat, is not to empower black people with these stories. Their agenda is to make money, is to monetize. And so because of this agenda, they have limited the growth rate of the black empowerment movement through cinema. Let me expound on this. So that's a lot that I said just there. They've limited the expansion. Because when you think about Black Panther, the first Black Panther, what that did for Black culture in 2018, it wasn't created by Marvel. It was a movement going on social media. Black people on social media were tired of the discrimination, oppression, all these things. Black people were tired. And we used social media as a tool to get our voices out there. And then there was this big Black movement. We saw it, from the Black hair, natural hair movement, Black pride, Black Lives Matter, Beyonce going, pushing that movement. We saw this movement expanding. Then we called for strong Black actors. We called for stronger Black movies. We called for movies about Black people that weren't showcasing just slavery, that focused on empowerment. And then Black Panther came, and it was the advent of the Black movement. It was a pioneer because in cinema, it was the first time we got to push the agenda of Black African excellence in cinema. So it pioneered that movement. But this movie, Wakanda Forever, does not continue or carry the baton to continue that race. Because what Black Panther was in 2018, it pioneered a movement. It made it mainstream to push Black stories that supports Black excellence, that supports Black pride, that encourage this in cinema. And when you have to understand, cinema is influential. When you inspire people through cinema, it trickles down to every fabric of society, right? So we've seen this movement trickle down and expand and expand and expand in the past how many years since Black Panther. And so this movie did not carry the baton because this movie did not act as a pioneer in that movement to open up and usher in the new wave of Blackness and Black stories. It did not do that. Instead, it sort of just floated in the water as another form of Black art, not really pushing that movement as it did previously. And that's a lot of pressure, big shoes to fill. I understand that. But we're talking about Marvel, and this is what Marvel does. This is what Disney does. So the only reason I would say that they didn't do that in this movie is because it wasn't in their agenda. It's because it doesn't appeal to white supremacy to continue to usher in and support the expansion and the growth of Black cinema, of Black stories, of Black people, and the empowerment of Black people. It does not serve white supremacy to do that, to continue to do that. Sure, we did it in the first place because we're going to make a lot of money from this. People are tired of Anglo-Saxon storytelling. I've interviewed quite a few executives in film, from, distributors, all of that. People are tired of Anglo-Saxon protagonists and storytelling. People want different stories, and that's where the drive and the opportunity came when creating the first Black Panther. But this one, if we usher them into the new era, well, that's going to be a problem. That's going to give them, too much inspiration. So we're not going to do that. We're just kind of just sit in the water and let them figure it out. And so this movie for me was a disservice to Blackness because it didn't do what it was supposed to do, what Marvel does. It didn't focus on expanding Black culture. It just kind of said, let's just sit here. Let's just see what happens. Right. Let's just sit here. Let's not focus on that. So let me break this down for you. As I've established, Marvel, Disney, these are all industries or businesses run by white society, white people. And so in their minds, they're thinking, well, let's just give them a 2-for-1. Let's give them a 2-for-1, huh? the story of the marginalized groups. Let's lump their stories together. The Mayan Empire, Africa. Let's just lump it all together. When in reality, when you think about the Mayan Empire, I've obviously gone to Mexico and seen some of the fascinating stories. It's so rich. It's so distinct that in reality, it deserves its own movie, its own story. Black Panther. Africa as a continent of 1 billion people it's the richest culture in the world. When I say that, it's the most diverse set of people, diverse in biology, diverse in language, diverse in culture, diverse in accents, diverse in aesthetics, in looks. It is extremely diverse. So to me, how can you lump Africa and Mexico, or the Mayan Empire, the countries within the Mayan Empire, how can you lump them together and say, well, let's put them together? Because in reality, Africans and Mexicans never interact in reality. Africa's continent, this continent is thousands and thousands of miles away from Central America. So far away. So when would these two ever interact? Except for through the lens of white America. That's the only time you see Africans, this story is about Africa. It's Wakanda. It's a country in Africa, right? A fictional country in Africa. Why would fictional African people be interacting with Mexicans when their cultures are not just very distinct and different, they are just so far away from each other that they would never even interact or coexist? Because they coexist in America. They coexist in America as minorities. And that's where they find their similarities. And that's why I say this story is an American story through the lens of an American perspective of what Africa is. And that's fundamentally the flaw of this storytelling. Because it will never service Black people. It will never service Africans. It will always service whiteness, white supremacy, the white supremacist agenda. It will never service Africans and Blacks. It's not going to, because it was not designed to do that. So, when I talk about the richness of Africa, when I talk about how distinct Africa is, I say this because in this story, Wakanda Forever, they had the opportunity to expound on Africa as a continent and highlight a different, diverse culture within Africa. But instead, they went all the way to Central America to do that. And that's the biggest flaw. That just shows us the agenda is not about tapping into the African story as this movie was set in. The agenda was to service the West's agenda. And so I just want to give you an example. If you look at a map right now and you look at the real African map, right? You see this right here. If in the fictional map, in the fictional country of Wakanda is where Niger is, right? This is Niger in real life. So that's northern. It's the northern border of Nigeria. Wakanda is apparently a fictional country, obviously, but a country in Western Africa. But when you look at people from Niger, what do they look like? First of all, you look at people from Nigeria, they look like me. These people from chat here. People from Niger, all the people from Niger I know look like this. They look like this. They look like this, right? Some of them are blacks, yes, but they're lighter skinned, finer hair, more Arab looking. These are people from Niger that I know. And I would think, I don't want to say I represent what a Nigerian looks like, but we're black people. And obviously Nigeria, like, there's not just one way that Nigerian looks or Nigerians look, because northern Nigerians have a more similar look to Niger. Different parts of Nigeria, people look different. That's how distinct Africa is, because when it comes down to it, there is more biological diversity. There's more biological diversity in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And I mean that so much so that, like me, for example, I could have more biological similarities with somebody in Europe or in America than someone in a neighboring African country to me. Or maybe, you see what I'm saying? And that's because of because Africa is the foundation of humanity. Africa is the birthplace of humanity. So everybody comes from Africa. And what happened historically is that people migrated out of Africa, right? Thousands and thousands of years ago, people migrated out of Africa, and they are closer related to me, the people that migrated there, than the people who are also distant cousins. And let's say, okay, let me give you a country, Kenya, for example, or I'll say the UK, Kenya. My ancestors might have migrated, or not my ancestors' cousins would have migrated to, let's say, I don't know, to Europe, somewhere, the UK or somewhere, right? Migrated across Europe, right? And obviously, that the planet was not Pangea, all that stuff. Go Google it. Migrated there, which was closer in time to the even more thousands of years ago, where my ancestors were in Kenya, or my ancestors' cousins were in Kenya. See what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that you have more biological similarities with people in Europe than you do with people in Kenya, if you're a Nigerian or some other random country. That's how much biological diversity there is. And I say all this to say that there's so many more stories, there's so many more mythologies, there's so many more cultures that could have been explored in Wakanda Forever, but they didn't do that. They chose to move to the next, marginalized group, and let's include them in this story, which I have no problem with unity. I have no problem with those things. It's not about that. If this was truly an African story about promoting Black pride and all these things that they claim to be in the first place, they would have stuck to that agenda, and they would have created another story for the Mayan Empire, which is rich, vast, and so interesting. Such a great story. I would have loved to explore that fully. But that's not what this movie did, because that's not the agenda. So, the richest of Africa So my issue is here, instead of that, they sort of mash it all together and just say, hey, let's just give them a 2-for-1 and let's just figure this out. Let me just continue here. So this just shows me, this is further proof to me that this story was not in service of Blackness and Black pride and all of that, but it was in service of white supremacy for all the reasons for all the aforementioned reasons that I gave. Because in the first Black Panther, they were going to make money from it. It was an opportunity to make money. And now they're like, whoa, let's not give them too much empowerment. Ultimately, and rightfully so, if Black people want to tell our stories, we have to do it ourselves. We can't expect other people to do it for us, right? We can't expect other people to give us handouts, right? So ultimately, my point is this, I'm not here complaining and saying, oh no, Marvel didn't serve us justice. They didn't do it right for us. I'm saying that this should inspire more Black people, more Africans to tell Black and African stories, to empower Black and Africanness. This should be, because if we put it in the hands of another culture, they're never going to do us justice, because first of all, that's not their job to do us justice. It's not their job to do us justice. And it doesn't help them if they do us justice. Only we can do us justice. Only we can celebrate ourselves the way that they celebrate themselves, or how we believe we deserve to be celebrated, instead of comparing ourselves to them. So, moreover, in an attempt for Black Americans to build a strong cultural identity based on their roots, white supremacy by design continues to dilute and monitor it. So this movie, the first Black Panther, acted as a guise of, oh, let's empower Black people. But really and truly, when it comes down to it, the people that suffer most from this are ADOS, African descendants of American descendants of slaves. These are people that suffer most from it. Yes. Ooh, what happened there? These are people that suffer most from this. Yes, Africans suffer most for a lot from it, but we're not deprived of our culture and our heritage. You know, we're not deprived of that. You walk around, if you go to Africa, if you go to Nigeria, Western Africa, if you go around the continent, you're going to see true African pride, true heritage, and it's embedded in our DNA. It's embedded in the foods that we eat. It's embedded in our lifestyles, the way we speak, our language, everything that we do. But when it comes to America, obviously when you look at the history of slavery and all your culture, all your Africanness was stripped away from you in America, stripped and stolen away from you. In fact, I made a documentary about this. I talk about this documentary often, The Great Divide. Go watch it, link down below. But when they put Black people, my brothers and sisters, when they put them on the slave ship, just before they got on the slave ship, they made them drink this potion. It's a potion from a well. This is in Badagry slave port in Nigeria. And this potion had voodoo in it. It had, I'm sure, God knows what it was. But it made the slaves forget everything. All of their history, where they're from, made them forget everything for months. And so they would get on this ship. Well, this is the mythology that we hear, or this is what they tell us when we go there, right? They get on the ship and they forget who they are, where they're from. They forget everything. They go to the new world and they're told who they are. They're told that your last name is now Smith. Your last name is now De Silva. Your last name is now whatever. Your whole identity, your mother, your father, whoever you were, it doesn't exist anymore. So in a way, they give them this pseudo reality whereby we're stripping you of your heritage. We're pushing you into a new identity of whiteness and white society. But within that whiteness and white society, we're going to deny you. We're going to deny you pride. We're going to deny you everything, because within this context, within this white supremacy landscape, you're inferior. So you do not deserve American pride. You do not benefit from your Americanness the way that other white Americans do. You do not benefit. You are not culturally the same as us. And so let me break this down now. In an attempt for Black Americans to build a strong cultural identity based on their roots, the system designed by white supremacy ensures that it dilutes and monitors your attempt. And this is exactly what this movie is doing. This movie is diluting your attempt to create your heritage, because they're giving you this false sense of Black pride. We will show you Africa. We will show you the superficialities of what Africa is without truly focusing on what really matters, which is uniting you with your history and your culture and letting you dive into that. Notice that in the story, they went into the history of the Mayan Empire. Well, not fully, but they tapped into a little bit of those histories. What about the African histories? They didn't tell us anything. Imagine a story about Africa, in Africa, and they don't tell you African history. Instead, they tell you about Mayan history. And you don't understand that you're being ripped and denied of your culture and your heritage. The reason why white supremacy exists and survives is because of erasure, because they erase your history and your heritage. So let me continue. This film represents how Black Americans are encouraged to experience sanitized versions of Africa and their roots, a version crafted through a white supremacist lens, which was originally designed to divide them from their roots, and so therefore will never work to unify them with their roots. As long as Black foundational Americans continue to operate in this space, they will never truly connect with their heritage and find the grounding they so rightfully deserve. You have to know your history, and your history does not begin with slavery. Your history begins in Africa. And this identity that you're searching for will only be achieved fully. The richness of it, the fullness of it can only be achieved through learning your history, reading books, visiting Africa, diving deep, and encouraging more African authentic stories, because we all benefit from African stories. We all benefit from it. So why is that? Again, let's remember, Marvel is a white movie. Sorry, Marvel, Disney, these are white-run businesses, and their agenda is to serve, it's not to serve Black people, it's to serve white people. So when it comes down to it, America is a melting pot of different cultures and focuses on erasure. So this is another important point to bring up, right? America focuses on erasure of traditional cultures to assimilate to Americanness. This was an important tactic for the unification of the country. Because at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, America is a melting pot of different countries. Indigenous Americans were, their country was taken over by foreigners. And now how do you create one culture, one land? Well, you have to everyone's coming from the UK, from Spain, from Italy, from Germany, from Ukraine, from all these random countries, from Africa, from all over the world. And you're going to get a melting pot of different cultures, different ideologies, different things. And they say, no. When you come here, remove your culture and your heritage and assimilate into Americanness so we can create oneness. And that was very important in creating the national pride that we see in America today. That's why Americans are so overt and so pronounced about celebrating their Americanness. That's why it was important, because this is a country that was designed by fabrication. It's not a historically, it's not a country that was built by indigenous people. What America is today was built by foreigners. It's, and people that came with one ideology, freeness, right? The land of the free. We want freeness, and we want to allow anybody in the world. And till this day, America imports the world's brightest minds. So here's the thing. This unification of America was important. So they had to strip everybody that comes to this country. You have to be stripped away from your identity, your previous identity, because when you come here to this new world, you're a new person and you have to assimilate. But here is the catch with that. It only benefits white people, because Americanness is only truly encouraged and celebrated in white people. And non-white people or non-white Americans who have been in this country before or even as long as white people are othered and made to feel exotic and foreign. If you're not a white American, despite you being Indigenous American, being an Indigenous American and being here before the white man came here, despite you being a black man who built this country, they brought you along with the white people as they migrated here. You migrated. Some of you have been here longer than some of the white people. Historically, you were still made to feel exotic and othered and foreign. Until this day, when we look at how the media depicts black Americans, they look at black Americans like some exotic animal, some exotic creature. It's so ridiculous. Some exotic thing. The blacks. This is what the blacks do. This is what they do. And so who suffers from this? So while America focuses on erasure of non-American cultures to unify the nation, it has traditionally excluded non-white people from their Americanness at the same time. This has forced blacks, African descendants of American descendants of slaves, especially to desperately search for grounding in their identity. So the problem and why black Americans suffer the most from this is because you are stripped away from your Africanness, you are told to forget it, and you come here and you try to connect with your Americanness, and they say you're not American. You're not American enough. You're black. You're othered. You're not. You're foreign. You're exotic. But you've been here longer than them. You've been here longer than them. Some of them. You've been here as long or even longer than them. And some of you are even mixed with Indigenous Americans. And this is your land. But no, they'd still deny you your rights. So they too historically stripped from their African culture, yes, and forced, okay. And so you're never validated in this system. The title white American, and this is how you see it even, for example, in the title of, you say an American, that's typically just a white person or white American. But with a black American, they don't say black Americans, they say African American. You're from Africa. Go back to Africa. I'm African American. I'm literally African, Nigerian American, and I'm American, right? I'm not foundational American. I'm African American. And so black American, that's why black people in America, descendants of slaves, have fought to say, no, we're not African American, we're black American. Well, the catch is I'm also black American. I'm black American, I'm African American. Whatever. I'm a different time. I'm not foundational American. That's why people are being more specific. American descendants of slaves. Foundational American. And I don't even like the term American descendants of slaves because it's like attaching your identity to slavery, and that's not right. So I like the term foundational American or foundational black American. That to me is a better term to describe it. Because you guys laid the foundation literally of this country and built it to what it was today, because America would not be successful without the free labor from blacks. It would not be. Free labor from black people. And so, my point is, this has resulted in the diluting of African Americans, black Americans, foundational black Americans, cultural pride, and therefore sense of self-worth. Because though this country may have been built by them, but it wasn't built for them. And as a result, marginalized groups are searching desperately for their cultural identity. Because what happens when you're stripped of your history as an African, when you came on the slave ship, stripped of your history, you came here, they gave you forced you to assimilate to their system and their culture, but still denied you of your Americanness, then you're now searching for that cultural grounding, that cultural heritage. You are searching for it because you're denied it on a consistent daily basis here in America. And so the problem now is the only way you can truly find that is by connecting deeply to your roots, your African roots. But there's this erasure of African stories. And so why the movie like Wakanda Forever is problematic is because you have the opportunity to go deep, delve deeper into a new African story, a new African culture, expose us to more richness of Africa, but instead you dilute it and you focus on another marginalized American group, not even giving that the justice that it deserves, skimming through it and lumping everything together. And that's the problem with the things being approved through the white lens. They will summarize Africa as one. They will summarize Africa as one, one place, just one. But how do you summarize 1 billion people? How do you summarize, when you think about Nigeria, over 250 different languages in one country, 2,500 dialects. How do you summarize that? Even within Nigeria, we're not unified culturally. Our cultures are so distinct. That's just one country, the most populous country in Africa, but just one country. Think about all the other diversities within African countries and how we're not unified. But this story focuses on lumping everything together. Look, there are pros and cons to unification, but one of the cons is the loss of cultural identity. And that is a massive con, because what that gives you is a sense of self-worth that is unmatched, that's impenetrable. When I look at my ancestors from the Benin Empire, right? Kings, that is embedded in my DNA. That's embedded in the stories. That's embedded in the culture in my household. How they instill self-worth in me. It's embedded in me. And people that are made to lack and lose their history and culture do not have that sense of self-worth, that grounding that is rooted deep in them and in their ancestry for thousands of years. And so what I'm saying is, for American descendants of slaves, okay, I hate that term, foundational Black Americans, to truly connect with that, they need to make the effort to explore Africa and to learn African stories and to read African history. And why Wakanda Forever failed at that is because though the movie, the original one, serviced that need, acted as though it was going to do that, acted as though that was the agenda to push African pride and African stories, African culture and histories, this new one kind of dropped the ball there. So, when it comes to it, in reality, these two very distinct cultures, African, West Africans, and, Indigenous Americans, Indigenous Americans being, people from the Mayan Empire, so modern day Mexico and surrounding countries. In reality, these cultures are so distinct, they would never even interact with each other. But in this movie, because this movie is designed through the lens of whiteness and white supremacy, this is where we're seeing them interact with each other. In reality, these two very distinct cultures only ever interacted when they were both in America. So since Wakanda is in Africa, there is no reason for them to be interacting. But in this story, they're still interacting as pseudo-allies against whites in America. This mirroring from the realities of slavery and how these two groups historically interacted with white Americans. This is mirroring. This really isn't a story about Africans, but a revenge movie seeking reparations from slavery and the empowerment in the identities of Blacks and Native Americans. Let me read that again. This movie really isn't a story about Africans, which is what they market it as, but a revenge movie seeking reparations from slavery and empowerment in the identities of Blacks and Native Americans. So you're seeking reparations from slavery by showing Black pride and we don't need white man and all that stuff. That's what the narrative was. And you're seeking empowerment in your identities for Blacks and Native Americans, but you fail to do so because you don't do what it takes to actually get there, to actually do the work that will actually ensure that you empower your identity, which is what I broke down earlier. Another thing that was so interesting to me here, even though America is totally irrelevant in this story, they found a way to insert it by having an MIT student. Let me show you the MIT student again. This girl right here. So even though America is irrelevant in this story, they still found a way to insert America by having an MIT student involved. So basically you're telling me that this one MIT student is an excuse to include America in this story. And as Wakanda is considered a superpower because Wakanda is a superpower, it's quite interesting that they chose this one girl was the reason why America is watching you. America is watching you because of this one girl in this story. The story mirrors reality and white supremacist ideology in that American minorities who are represented in this story, Blacks and Mexicans, always have to exist through the affirmation of white people and worry about what white people think about their actions. So this whole story, as much as they love to pretend and show like Wakanda is so powerful, we don't need America, blah, 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 you guys have to answer to us. They kept pushing this narrative, but yet America was monitoring them throughout the story. Even the Mexicans in the story, the Mayan Empire and people, they were saying, oh, don't tell the Americans about us. Don't tell the Americans about us. You'll get in trouble if you tell the Americans about us. You're still existing through the lens of, not being how white people perceive you, white people's affirmations. Oh, don't tell Massa that I stole the fruit. Don't tell Massa it's the same thing. Even though they're trying to position it as that, they're still showing that these marginalized groups exist by seeking the affirmation of white America. So even though the story tried to play it off like Wakanda is so powerful and don't answer to America, the story still found ways to include American surveillance of minorities. This represents that this story was written by American minorities who are used to the conditioning and the prisons of slavery. Even though they are given a fictional world of empowered Blacks, they still find a way to have white society police them. Oh, that's such a line here. Let me read that again. This represents that this story was written by an American minority who are used to the conditioning and prisons of slavery. Even when they are given a fictional world of empowered Blacks, they still find a way to have white society police them. This is how deeply rooted the loss of identity that minorities in America have. This is how they have battered them to a pulp, to submission, because you're constantly thinking about your master even when you're given the opportunity to move away from them. And if this was a true African story, America would not even have been included in the conversation. Because if we're talking about Wakanda, why show America? Yes, I get it. It's an American-funded film. America has an agenda. But this goes to my point. This is why my point is that Black people must tell Black stories. If we want true cultural identity, if we want a grounding in our cultural identity, we want Black empowerment, we must tell our stories. We can't wait for Marvel. We can't wait for whatever, Disney, to tell our stories. We have to do it ourselves. And we have to do it in an epic way. And you can't say that we can't do it because we can't. We just don't. We haven't done it yet. And the fact that the biggest African story, the best-selling African story is made by a white man, that should be problematic to you. That should be a problem to you. That should be a problem to you. So for marketing reasons, it's clear they also chose the American storyline for the story to appeal to an American audience. It's an American story ultimately. So of course it makes sense they're going to put America in it. America is obsessed with America. Ooh. You know, if this was a UK story, sure, they might not have included the UK. But America is obsessed with promoting American patriotism for all the reasons I mentioned before. Just to recap that, it's a melting pot of different cultures. It was created, it's a new country, you know, just a few hundred years old, very new country. And so pushing this American agenda builds up that pride, which would have been non-existent in the start of America. So they have to keep that going. It makes sense, right? So it makes sense, of course. It's kind of like when people complain about how like Kanye West wasn't canceled when he said stuff about Black people, but when he said stuff about Jews, he got canceled. Well, if you have Jews that are very powerful, and I'm a Jewish person and I own a business, I happen to run some big studio where I'm not going to hire Kanye West because Jewish people are in positions of power to do that. And so in the same breath, if we want, you can't expect somebody else to tell your story. If Black people want us to tell our stories the way that will actually really serve us, we have to tell our stories ourselves. That's the point here. So even though the story tried to portray Wakandans as powerful, they don't need to answer, and like they don't need to answer to Americans. The whole if you tell the Americans about us narrative, that whole narrative just made America seem more powerful ultimately. So that was a long video, but I think you guys catch the drift. Point being here is that yes, this movie is a revenge movie, right? It was a revenge movie for the marginalized, but it did no service. It did a disservice to Blackness. But if anything, it shone a light to me on what we need to focus on as Black people, Black media, how we need to push our stories, how we need to support ourselves, how we need to tell Black stories. It shone a light on all these things for me. You know, it was great on the surface level. It was a great movie. I have no problem with it. Great movie on the surface. Nothing wrong with it. But when you look a little deeper, there are issues, there are fundamental issues with this story. And so I'm afraid that Black people will watch this movie and think, you know, I saw people in the movie theaters all dressed up wearing their Africa outfits, and I saw all of that, and it's all great. But it really just says that we need to get to work. We need to focus on telling our stories, our histories, educating ourselves. We need to get to work. And if we don't get to work, well, we're going to continue to get these diluted, sanitized versions of our culture and our history. Black stories told through the lens of white supremacy that never really truly serve us. And so you know, these outfits that you wear for the Wakanda Forever, what do they really mean? And how do we focus in the next, what I would have liked to see from Wakanda Forever was, like I said, to pioneer the next movement, the next wave, open up the next new door. But if we open up the next new door, I think there's a fear by white supremacist media that we might get too powerful. We might power them, and that's probably what's going to happen. But it's up to us to take ourselves to the next level. It's not their job to do it anyway. It's not their job to do it. It's our job to do it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Wakanda Forever. I still advise you go watch the movie. It's an interesting movie. Definitely great storytelling. It's Marvel, all that cheesy stuff. It's a great, entertaining movie. On my other channel, Brand Video Pro, I'm going to break down some of the other aspects of the movie. But on here, I just wanted to let you guys know my thoughts on how this movie was a disservice to Black people. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm Kenim. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, all the above. Guys, please give me like at least, let me get like 100 likes at least on this video. Let me know your thoughts. Leave a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Kenim. Bye. Peace.